The autumn wind rattled the windows of Ashworth Manor with a mournful persistence, as though the very air mourned what was about to transpire within its cold stone walls. The estate sprawled across the English countryside like a sleeping giant, its gardens overgrown with neglect, its halls echoing with the ghosts of a legacy slowly crumbling beneath the weight of debt and dysfunction. Inside the master bedchamber, candlelight flickered against dark wood paneling, casting shadows that seemed to writhe with their own discontent. Lady Eleanor Ashworth now, as of 3 hours prior, stood by the window in her wedding gown, a confection of ivory silk and delicate lace that had been her mother's and her grandmother's before her, watching the skeletal branches of ancient oaks bend against the wind. She had not removed her veil, though the ceremony was long concluded. The wedding breakfast endured, the last guest departed into the gathering darkness. Behind her, she heard the heavy tread of boots against wooden floors, the decisive click of a door closing, the sound of her new husband moving through the space with the contained energy of a man fulfilling an obligation. Duke Sebastian Ashworth was 32 years of age, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell across a forehead perpetually creased with the burden of responsibility, eyes the color of winter storms, and a mouth that seemed to have forgotten the shape of a smile. He was considered formidable in London society, a man whose very name commanded respect and inspired a certain wariness, whose late father's cruelty had been whispered about in drawing rooms, whose mother's tragic decline had been mourned by those who remembered her gentle spirit. Eleanor had met him precisely 4 times before this day, twice at formal introductions orchestrated by their families, once at a musicale where they exchanged perhaps a dozen words, and once when the marriage contract was signed in the presence of solicitors and witnesses. She knew his reputation, knew the estate needed an heir to satisfy the terms of his inheritance, knew her own family's modest nobility required the alliance to secure their standing. What she had not known, until this moment as he crossed the room toward her with mechanical purpose, was how thoroughly one's heart could break while one's face remained composed. "Lady Ashworth," he said, his voice deep and without inflection, formal as a business transaction. She turned from the window to face him, her hands clasped before her, her chin lifted with the quiet dignity that had been remarked upon since her childhood. "Your Grace," she replied, her voice steady despite the trembling that had taken residence in her chest. He stood before her, this stranger who was now her husband, and in his eyes she saw nothing, no warmth, no curiosity, no recognition of her as anything beyond a vessel for his purposes. "I believe we should establish the nature of our arrangement clearly," Sebastian continued, removing his jacket with brisk efficiency, folding it over the back of a chair as though they were discussing estate management rather than the foundation of their shared existence. "I need an heir, not a wife. This marriage serves a purpose, fulfills a requirement of my inheritance, and secures the Ashworth line. Beyond that obligation, I expect nothing from you, and you should expect nothing from me save civility and provision." The words fell between them like stones dropped into still water, their ripples spreading outward to touch every corner of the room, every possibility of what might have been. Eleanor felt something inside her chest collapse, some small flame of hope she had not even realized she was nurturing, extinguishing itself with a quiet finality. She had known this was an arranged marriage, had understood the practical nature of their union, but somewhere in the secret chambers of her heart, she had harbored the foolish notion that perhaps, given time, affection might grow between them, that companionship might bloom from proximity, that the life stretching before them might contain some measure of warmth. His declaration stripped away that delusion with surgical precision. "I understand, Your Grace," she said softly, each word carefully measured, her training in composure serving her now as it had through countless social trials. "Then we have an understanding," he replied, already turning away from her, already dismissing her from his attention. What followed was duty performed without tenderness, obligation fulfilled without connection, a joining of bodies that left their souls entirely separate. Eleanor endured it with the same quiet grace she brought to all things, her eyes fixed on the canopy above, her mind retreating to the library of her childhood home, to the novels she loved, where marriages transformed into grand passions, where cold hearts thawed and redemption waited at the end of suffering. When it was finished, Sebastian rose without a word, dressed, and departed to his own chambers, leaving Eleanor alone in the darkness with only the wind for company. She lay still for a long while, listening to the manor settle around her, feeling the weight of her new reality pressing against her chest like a physical thing. This was her life now, this beautiful prison, this loveless arrangement, this slow erosion of the romantic dreams she had cherished. Tomorrow she would rise and assume her duties as Duchess of Ashworth, would navigate the vast cold halls of this estate, would smile and nod and perform her role with impeccable grace. But tonight, in the privacy of darkness, she allowed herself to acknowledge the grief settling into her bones, the particular loneliness of lying in a marriage bed utterly alone, the heartbreak of knowing she would spend her days loving a man who had just informed her he required nothing from her but an heir. But before our lover's fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and scandal. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Now, let's begin. The weeks that followed Eleanor's wedding night settled into a pattern of elegant isolation, days that stretched long and empty despite the grandeur surrounding her. She woke each morning in the vast bedchamber alone, Sebastian having departed before dawn to attend to estate business or ride across the grounds, or simply to avoid her presence, and she would lie there watching pale autumn light filter through heavy damask curtains, listening to the manor awaken around her with the soft footfalls of servants, the distant clatter of kitchen preparations, the creaking of old wood adjusting to the day's temperature. Her mornings were spent in the library, a magnificent room lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes, where she would lose herself in novels and poetry, in the worlds created by minds far removed from her current reality, her fingers trailing over gilt edges as she sought comfort in the constancy of words that never changed, never disappointed, never withdrew affection that had never been offered in the first place. The servants treated her with respectful kindness, though she sensed their pity in the gentle way Mrs. Holbrook, the housekeeper, would ask after her comfort, in how young Mary brought extra tea without being asked, in the careful averting of eyes, when Sebastian would enter a room and acknowledge his wife with nothing more than a curt nod before departing again. Afternoons found Eleanor walking the estate grounds, her shawl wrapped tight against the increasingly cold wind, exploring overgrown paths and neglected gardens, discovering a small rose garden that had clearly once been tended with great care, but now grew wild and tangled, its blooms fighting through weeds with desperate beauty. During formal dinners, the only occasions when she and Sebastian occupied the same space with any regularity, they would sit at opposite ends of an absurdly long table, separated by candelabras and elaborate centerpieces, engaging in polite conversation about nothing of consequence, his responses measured and distant. Her attempts at connection met with walls so carefully constructed she could nearly see the mortar between the stones. Yet, in the quiet hours, when the household slept and Eleanor wandered the halls unable to find rest, she began to notice things about her husband that suggested depths he refused to reveal. How light glowed from beneath his study door well past midnight. How he would stand before the portrait of a beautiful woman in the gallery his mother, Mrs. Holbrook, had whispered, dead these 15 years from a broken spirit. Her husband's cruelty had shattered, with an expression of such profound sorrow that Eleanor would retreat rather than intrude upon his private grief. She learned from the servants, in fragments of overheard conversations, that the previous duke had been a man of legendary coldness, that he had beaten his son for any display of emotion, that Sebastian's childhood had been one of rigid discipline and punishment for perceived weakness, that his mother had withered under such treatment until she simply gave up the will to live. Eleanor began to understand that the walls Sebastian maintained were not natural formations, but deliberate constructions. Fortifications built stone by stone through years of learning that to feel was to suffer, that to love was to invite destruction. One evening during a fierce autumn storm, when thunder shook the window panes and rain lashed against the manor with vindictive force, Eleanor sat in the library reading by lamplight, seeking distraction from her loneliness in the pages of a novel, and she heard the door open, felt rather than saw Sebastian enter the room, his presence filling the space with its characteristic tension, and she looked up to find him standing there soaked from his ride, water dripping from his coat, his hair plastered to his forehead, his eyes holding something she could not quite identify, not warmth precisely, but perhaps the faintest recognition of her as something more than an obligation. He said nothing, made no explanation for his intrusion into what had become her sanctuary, simply crossed to the fireplace and stood there as water pooled at his feet, staring into the flames as though seeking answers in their dance. And Eleanor, her heart suddenly racing with the significance of this small deviation from his pattern of avoidance, returned her gaze to her book, though she could no longer make sense of the words, aware of him with every fiber of her being, conscious of his breathing, his stillness, and the way his fingers gripped the mantelpiece, as though anchoring himself against some internal storm more violent than the one raging outside. An hour passed in this strange communion, neither speaking, the only sounds the crackling of fire and the drumming of rain, and when Sebastian finally left, he paused at the door and turned back to look at her with an expression that might have been longing, or might have been regret, or might have been nothing more than her desperate imagination, projecting meaning where none existed. And then he was gone, leaving Eleanor alone with her racing thoughts and the first fragile stirring of something she dared not name. The faint possibility that beneath her husband's armor there existed a man capable of feeling, a heart that had been taught not to beat but had never quite forgotten how. Weeks passed in their careful dance of proximity and distance, the autumn surrendering to winter's first cold breath, and with each passing day the unspoken expectation of an heir pressed more heavily upon Eleanor's shoulders, a weight she carried with the same quiet grace she brought to all her duties, though internally she felt herself fragmenting under the strain of this particular indignity, this reduction of her entire being to a single biological function, while her heart and mind and soul went unacknowledged, unwanted, unnecessary to the man who visited her chambers with mechanical regularity, on the nights the physician deemed most propitious for conception, performing his duty with the same detached efficiency one might bring to signing documents or reviewing accounts, never meeting her eyes, never offering tenderness, never suggesting through word or gesture that she was anything more than the vessel he had declared her to be on their wedding night. Eleanor endured these encounters with a composure that would have made her mother proud, her training and deportment serving her even in moments of such profound loneliness. But afterward, she would lie in the darkness listening to Sebastian's retreating footsteps and allow herself to grieve the romantic dreams she had once harbored, the foolish girlhood fantasies of a marriage built on affection and companionship, the hope that perhaps she might find in her husband not just duty but desire, not just obligation but joy, dreams that now seemed as distant and impossible as the stars she watched through her window on sleepless nights. Then, as November's chills settled over the estate, with bitter determination, Eleanor fell ill with a fever that came upon her suddenly during an afternoon walk, transforming within hours from a slight headache to a raging inferno that left her delirious and trembling, her skin burning to the touch, her body racked with chills that no number of blankets could warm, and Mrs. Holbrook sent immediately for the physician, while the household moved into the controlled chaos of crisis, servants carrying water and clean linens, stoking fires to excessive heat, whispering prayers in corridors. What happened next would puzzle the staff for weeks to come and plant in Eleanor's heart the first seed of genuine hope she had felt since arriving at Ashworth Manor. For Sebastian, who might have been expected to maintain his characteristic distance, who had every reason to delegate her care entirely to servants and physicians, instead appeared in her sick room within the hour and refused to leave, pulling a chair to her bedside and settling into it with the grim determination of a soldier taking a position he meant to hold regardless of cost, his hand reaching out to press against her fevered forehead with a gentleness that seemed at odds with everything she knew of him, his voice low and steady as he ordered the physician to spare no expense or effort in her treatment, his eyes betraying something that looked almost like fear. Through the haze of her illness, Eleanor was dimly aware of his presence, of cool cloths being pressed to her burning skin by hands she somehow knew were his, of a deep voice speaking to her in tones she had never heard him use, urging her to fight, to stay, to not surrender to the fever's pull. And once, in a moment of clarity that pierced through the delirium, she opened her eyes to find him sitting beside her in the grey light of dawn, his face haggard with exhaustion, his hand holding hers with a grip that spoke of desperation, and their eyes met for a heartbeat before the fever claimed her again, and she descended back into fevered dreams. 3 days and nights he remained at her bedside, accepting food only when Mrs. Holbrook insisted, sleeping in fitful moments in his chair, changing the cloths on her forehead with his own hands. And when the fever finally broke on the fourth morning, and Eleanor woke weak but lucid, the first thing she saw was Sebastian slumped in his chair beside her, his head resting on the edge of her bed, his hand still holding hers, and for a moment, before he woke and the walls reconstructed themselves, she saw in his sleeping face something unguarded and achingly vulnerable, a glimpse of the man he might have been had his father not taught him that to care was to court destruction. When he realized she was awake, Sebastian withdrew immediately, stood, smoothed his rumpled clothing, arranged his features back into their customary reserve, and departed with nothing more than a curt statement that he was pleased to see her recovering, leaving Eleanor alone, with her racing thoughts and the undeniable evidence that somewhere beneath his armor, her husband possessed a heart capable of concern, perhaps even of feeling something more, and she began to wonder if the walls that separated them were not innate to his nature, but rather constructed through years of pain and fear, built stone by careful stone to protect a heart that had been taught love, was weakness, and weakness was unforgivable. And in that wondering, she felt something shift inside her own chest, a dangerous softening toward a man who had just demonstrated through action what he would never acknowledge in words, that despite his declarations and his distance, she mattered to him in some way he could not or would not name. As autumn deepened into November's cold embrace, painting the estate grounds in shades of amber and rust, small moments began to accumulate between Sebastian and Eleanor, like fallen leaves gathering in corners, unremarked upon but undeniably present, subtle shifts in the architecture of their careful distance that neither acknowledged aloud, yet both felt with increasing intensity. Eleanor, seeking purpose in her isolation and finding solace in creation, had discovered during her walks the neglected rose garden that had once belonged to Sebastian's mother, and with permission from Mrs. Holbrook, she had begun the patient work of restoration, spending her afternoons on her knees in the cold earth, pulling weeds and pruning back years of wild growth, her hands blistered and dirt-stained as she coaxed the garden back toward the beauty it must once have possessed, guided by an old groundskeeper's memories of how the Duchess had arranged each bed with careful intention, roses organized by color and bloom time, to create a symphony of fragrance that would last from spring through autumn's first frost. She did not do this work for Sebastian's notice or approval, but rather for her own need to nurture something, to see tangible evidence that care and patience could restore what neglect had nearly destroyed. Yet she could not help the small leap her heart made when she noticed from the library window one morning that Sebastian had been to the garden, his boot prints visible in the frost-covered paths, and then again the next day and the day after that, until it became clear he was visiting the space daily, though he never came when she was there, never mentioned the transformation she was working, simply walked among the beds she had cleared and replanted, as though seeking communion with some memory or ghost she could not see. It was Eleanor who discovered quite by accident, through an overheard conversation between Mrs. Holbrook and the estate steward, that Sebastian made regular anonymous donations to 3 orphanages in the county, substantial sums that he explicitly forbade the steward from entering in the estate's official ledgers, and when she carefully inquired about this practice, Mrs. Holbrook explained in hushed tones that the late Duke had considered charity a weakness that encouraged the poor in their poverty, had beaten young Sebastian severely when he discovered the boy had given his own coat to a freezing child in the village, and had forbidden all philanthropic endeavors as contrary to proper aristocratic dignity. Yet Sebastian in his adulthood had quietly defied his father's edicts, helping those his father would have condemned while taking pains to ensure no one knew of his generosity, as though even in rebellion he carried his father's voice, condemning kindness as shameful weakness. Then came the dinner party in late November, when Sebastian's peers from London descended upon the estate for a weekend of hunting and elaborate meals. Lord Pembroke and his wife, along with Sir Richard Hastings and the insufferable Lord Waverley, who drank too much claret and felt entitled to opinions on matters beyond his understanding. And during the second evening's dinner, as Eleanor sat making polite conversation about nothing of consequence, Lord Waverley made some dismissive comment about Eleanor's family being country gentry of no particular distinction, her father a baron whose lands could fit inside Ashworth stables, suggesting with wine-loosened tongue that Sebastian had married beneath himself, and questioning whether Eleanor possessed the refinement necessary for her position, and the table fell into shocked silence as Sebastian's hand came down on the polished wood with such force that crystal glasses jumped and rattled in their places. What followed was a masterclass in aristocratic evisceration, delivered in tones of such icy precision that even Eleanor, who was its beneficiary, felt the chill, Sebastian's voice cutting through the dining room as he informed Lord Waverley that Lady Eleanor possessed more genuine refinement in her smallest gesture than Waverley had demonstrated in his entire dissolute existence, and that her intelligence and grace elevated every space she occupied, while Waverley's presence tended to debase his surroundings. That Eleanor's provincial background, as Waverley termed it, had instilled in her a dignity and strength of character that Waverley's expensive education and London polish had utterly failed to provide him, and perhaps Waverley might consider departing the estate immediately if he found the Duchess's company so inadequate. A suggestion delivered with such cold finality that the man stammered apologies and fell silent, while the other guests studied their plates with sudden fascination. Eleanor sat frozen in astonishment, her heart racing as she watched her husband defend her with a ferocity she had never imagined him capable of on her behalf. This man, who barely acknowledged her existence, now verbally destroying a peer of the realm for the crime of insulting her worth, and when his eyes met hers across the length of the table, she saw something burning there that made her breath catch. Some fierce protectiveness or possessiveness, or perhaps something deeper that he quickly shuttered behind his customary reserve as he returned to his meal as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. The remainder of the evening passed in strained civility, guests departing early to their chambers, and when Eleanor retired to her own rooms, she found herself unable to settle, pacing before her fire as she replayed the scene again and again, and she heard the knock at her door with surprise, opened it to find Sebastian standing in the corridor still dressed for dinner, his expression unreadable as he asked if he might speak with her, and she stepped aside to let him enter her private space for the first time since her illness. They stood in her sitting room with the fire crackling between them, the silence stretching taut as a bowstring, and Sebastian seemed to struggle with words that would not come, his jaw tight and his hands clenched at his sides. And finally Eleanor said softly that she appreciated his defense of her at dinner, that it was kind of him to speak on her behalf, and something in her phrasing seemed to unlock his tongue because he said with startling intensity that it was not kindness but truth, that Waverley was a fool and she was worth 10 of him, worth 10 of all of them, that she had brought grace and intelligence to a house that had known neither, that the garden she had restored was more beautiful than he had seen it since his mother's death, that he noticed everything she did, even if he lacked the courage or words to acknowledge it. And then he stopped abruptly, as though appalled by his own candor, his face flushing as he stepped back toward the door, and Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest, some careful shell she had built around her heart to protect it from hoping, and she whispered his name, just Sebastian, the first time she had used it without his title, and he froze with his hand on the door handle. And for a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the small space that might as well have been an ocean, something enormous and unspoken, hanging between them like morning mist that would burn away if exposed to direct light. And then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, leaving Eleanor alone with the devastating realization that had been building through weeks of small observations and accumulated moments, the truth she could no longer deny even to herself. She was falling in love with her husband, with this wounded, walled man who had declared he needed an heir, not a wife, and the pain of this recognition settled deep in her bones because she understood with perfect clarity that loving someone who refused to be loved, who had constructed fortifications specifically designed to prevent the very connection she craved, would break her heart more thoroughly than his initial coldness ever could, for there is a peculiar agony in loving the unreachable, in seeing glimpses of what might be while knowing it will likely never fully emerge. And as Eleanor prepared for bed that night, her hands trembled with the weight of this knowledge, this love she had not chosen and could not unfeel, this impossible, unwanted, utterly consuming tenderness for a man who had shown her in 1,000 small ways that somewhere beneath his armor he possessed a heart worth loving, even as he did everything in his power to ensure that heart remained forever beyond her reach. Winter arrived at Ashworth Manor with brutal efficiency, transforming the estate into a landscape of stark beauty and bitter cold. Frost coating every window in elaborate crystalline patterns and snow falling in heavy silence that muffled the world into hushed isolation, and with the seasons turning came an intensification of the pressure that had been building since the wedding. For Sebastian's uncle, Lord Pemberton, arrived unannounced one grey December morning, accompanied by two of the estate's trustees, men in dark coats with ledgers and stern expressions, who closeted themselves with Sebastian in his study for hours, while Eleanor sat in the library pretending to read, but hearing through the heavy doors the raised voices discussing bloodlines and obligations and the concerning absence of any announcement regarding an heir, words that made her feel like livestock being evaluated for breeding potential rather than a human being with thoughts and feelings and a heart that was slowly breaking under the weight of this impossible situation. Sebastian emerged from that meeting looking haunted, his jaw tight and his eyes distant, and in the days that followed he became more withdrawn than ever, barely speaking at meals, disappearing into his study for entire afternoons, and Eleanor understood with painful clarity that he was being crushed between the demands of duty and whatever conflicted feelings he harbored but could not name, that the walls she had seen him beginning to lower were being reinforced stone by stone as the expectations of his position pressed down upon him with inexorable force. She tried to reach him in the small ways she had learned might penetrate his defenses, leaving books she thought he might enjoy in his study, ensuring his favorite foods appeared at dinner, asking gentle questions about estate business that might open conversations, but he met each overture with increasing coldness, as though he were deliberately pushing her away, and Eleanor felt herself becoming a ghost in her own home, drifting through rooms that grew colder despite roaring fires, haunting corridors where her footsteps echoed in empty solitude. It was during one of her solitary walks through the frost-covered garden in late December, wrapped in her heaviest cloak against the biting wind, that Eleanor finally allowed herself to confront the truth she had been avoiding. She could not continue living this way, could not spend years or perhaps decades loving a man who would never allow himself to love her in return, could not let herself be slowly eroded by this loneliness until nothing remained of the woman she had been, the woman who had once believed in beauty and hope and the possibility of happiness. She returned to her chambers with hands trembling from more than cold and sat at her writing desk, pulled out fresh paper and took up her pen and began to compose a letter to her parents that she never intended to send, but needed to write simply, to see the words in physical form, to make real the option she was beginning to consider. "My dearest Mama and Papa, I write to you in circumstances I never imagined I would face," she began, and the words that followed were an outpouring of everything she had held inside for months, the loneliness and the heartbreak and the soul-crushing reality of loving someone incapable of returning that love. And she found herself writing about the possibility of separation, of returning home, of seeking some arrangement that would free them both from a marriage that existed only in legal documents and empty rituals, though even as she wrote it her heart rebelled against the idea, because despite everything she loved him, loved this wounded impossible man who visited his mother's garden at dawn and donated secretly to orphanages and had sat by her sickbed with hands that trembled as he pressed cool cloths to her fevered brow, but love alone could not sustain her through this slow dissolution of self. She folded the letter carefully when it was finished and placed it in the bottom drawer of her writing desk beneath other papers, a secret kept even from herself, a possibility held in reserve should the pain become truly unbearable, and she did not know that 2 floors below in the servants' hall Mrs. Holbrook was at that very moment quietly reprimanding 2 maids who had been gossiping about the Duchess, about how they had seen her crying in the garden when she thought no one was watching, about the terrible sadness that hung around her like a shroud, and she did not know that Sebastian happened to be passing through the corridor outside the servants' hall at precisely that moment, that he stopped when he heard Eleanor's name and stood very still as he listened to the maids describing her tears, her loneliness, the way she tried so hard to be brave while clearly breaking inside, and something in Sebastian's chest, something he had thought successfully buried beneath years of careful control, cracked at the image of Eleanor crying alone in his mother's garden, and he stood frozen in that corridor, long after the servants' voices faded, stood with one hand pressed against the wall as though he needed its support to remain upright, and for the first time since his father's death, he felt tears burning behind his own eyes, because he knew with devastating certainty that he was the cause of her pain, that his cowardice and his walls, and his stubborn refusal to acknowledge what he felt were destroying the one person who had brought light into his darkness. And he did not know what to do with this knowledge, except carry it back to his study, where it sat like a stone in his chest, growing heavier with each passing hour. Each day that brought them closer to some breaking point, he could feel approaching but seemed powerless to prevent. The winter ball at Ashworth Manor in mid-January was an affair of considerable magnificence, the entire estate transformed by hundreds of candles that cast dancing shadows across walls, hung with garlands of evergreen and winter roses imported at enormous expense from London hothouses, and the ballroom filled with the cream of county society and several notable families from town who had made the journey despite treacherous roads, because an invitation from the Duke of Ashworth was not something one declined, and Eleanor had prepared for the evening with meticulous care, allowing her lady's maid to dress her in a gown of deep sapphire silk that brought out the color of her eyes, her dark hair arranged in an elaborate style that left her neck and shoulders bare, pearls at her throat, and ears that had belonged to Sebastian's mother and been sent to her rooms that afternoon with no accompanying note. And when she descended the grand staircase to greet arriving guests, she looked every inch the duchess she was meant to be, poised and elegant and heartbreakingly beautiful. Though Sebastian, watching from across the entrance hall, felt something twist painfully in his chest because he could see what others could not, could see the careful blankness in her eyes that spoke of a woman going through motions while feeling nothing, a performance of grace masking profound emptiness. The evening unfolded with predictable formality, Eleanor moving through the crowds with practiced ease, making polite conversation and accepting compliments with modest smiles, dancing when asked by appropriate partners, presiding over the gathering with a dignity that made Sebastian's uncle Lord Pemberton comment approvingly that she had grown into her role admirably. But Sebastian found he could not stop watching her, could not focus on his own conversations or obligations, because his attention kept returning to Eleanor across the room. And as the hours passed, he began to notice things that filled him with an emotion he had never experienced before, a hot, bitter feeling that he slowly recognized as jealousy. He watched as young Lord Hartley, a kind man known for his gentle manner and devotion to his wife, engaged Eleanor in conversation that made her laugh, actually laugh, a genuine sound Sebastian realized he had never heard from her, not once, in all their months of marriage, and the sight of that laughter directed at another man, the way her face transformed with real joy, made Sebastian's hands clench into fists at his sides. He watched as Sir Edmund Frost, recently widowed and wealthy, requested a second dance with Eleanor, and she accepted, the two of them moving together with easy grace, while Sebastian stood rigid against the wall, and he watched as Colonel Matthews, just returned from India with tales of exotic lands, held Eleanor's attention for nearly 20 minutes, her eyes bright with interest as he described temples and markets and monsoon rains, and Sebastian understood with devastating clarity that these men, warmer men, kinder men, men not crippled by fear and walls of their own construction, could make Eleanor happy in ways he had utterly failed to do, that she smiled for them in minutes more genuinely than she had smiled for him in months. And the realization was a knife twisting in his chest, because he had done this, had created this situation where his own wife found more joy in strangers' company than in his. The ball finally ended near midnight, guests departing in carriages that crunched through fresh fallen snow, and Sebastian stood in the entrance hall making farewells with Eleanor beside him, the two of them, the picture of aristocratic partnership to any observer. And when the last guest had gone, and the servants began extinguishing candles and clearing glasses, Eleanor turned toward the staircase without a word, and Sebastian found himself following her, climbing the stairs behind her in silence, his heart pounding with something like panic, because he knew he needed to speak to her, needed to say something, though he had no idea what. And when they reached the corridor where their paths would diverge, he heard himself say her name, Eleanor, and she stopped and turned to face him with polite inquiry, as though he were merely another guest, and he found he could not bear the formal distance in her expression, could not endure another moment of this terrible civilized coldness, and so he asked if he might speak with her in her chambers, and after a moment's hesitation she nodded and led him to her rooms. She did not invite him to sit, but instead walked through to the balcony that overlooked the snow-covered gardens, wrapping a heavy shawl around her shoulders against the cold night air, and Sebastian followed her outside, where their breath formed clouds in the freezing darkness, and stars blazed overhead with brittle winter clarity, and he stood beside her in silence for a long moment before asking the question that had been building in him all evening, the question he both needed and dreaded to have answered. "Are you unhappy?" Eleanor did not look at him but continued gazing out at the gardens, and when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet and utterly without inflection, as though she were commenting on the weather rather than the state of her soul. "I am lonely, Your Grace, in a house full of people, in a marriage that exists only in name." The words struck Sebastian with the force of physical blows, their devastating honesty cutting through every defense he possessed, and he found himself unable to respond, his throat tight and his hands trembling as Eleanor continued, still not looking at him, her voice soft but clear in the cold night air. "I watch you visit your mother's garden each morning, and I know you have a capacity for feeling you refuse to show me. I see you defend me to others with passion you never direct toward me. I learn of your secret charities and your hidden kindnesses, and I understand you are not incapable of warmth, but simply unwilling to extend it to me, and I cannot," her voice caught slightly before steadying, "I cannot continue to live as a ghost in your home, present but unseen, existing but not alive." Sebastian felt something crumbling inside him, those carefully constructed walls beginning to crack under the weight of her words, and he wanted to tell her everything, wanted to confess that he thought of her constantly, that the sight of her laughing with other men tonight had nearly destroyed him, that he was terrified, because somewhere in the past months she had become essential to him in ways he could not name and did not know how to acknowledge. But the words lodged in his throat, trapped behind years of his father's voice, telling him that love was weakness and vulnerability was death, and so instead he stood frozen and silent as Eleanor finally turned to look at him with eyes that held no anger, only a terrible, sad acceptance. And she said softly, "You need not answer, Your Grace. I already know." And she walked past him back into her chambers, leaving him alone on the balcony in the freezing dark. And Sebastian stood there long after she had gone, stood until the cold had numbed his fingers and his face, and when he finally returned to his own rooms, he found he could not sleep, could only pace and replay her words again and again, understanding that he had reached some critical moment, some crossroads where his continued silence and withdrawal would cost him something he could not afford to lose, but still not knowing, not yet, how to break through the prison of fear he had spent a lifetime building around his heart. The weeks following the winter ball stretched into months, as winter gradually surrendered to the first tentative signs of spring, snowdrops pushing through frozen ground and ice melting from tree branches in the pale March sunlight. But the thaw in nature found no echo within Ashworth Manor, where the coldness between Sebastian and Eleanor had calcified into something harder and more permanent than mere winter frost, a distance that felt final and irreversible, despite the careful civility they maintained in their few necessary interactions. Eleanor moved through her days with mechanical precision, attending to her duties as Duchess with flawless grace, while feeling nothing, her heart enclosed in protective numbness that allowed her to function without feeling the full weight of her despair. And she had come to understand with painful clarity that she could not continue this way and could not spend her remaining years as a living ghost haunting rooms that would never feel like home, loving a man who would never allow himself to be loved in return. She spent long hours in the library, staring at books without reading them, walked the estate grounds without seeing their beauty, lay awake at night, confronting the terrible truth that she had to save herself because no one else would, and the realization brought with it a strange calm, an acceptance born of necessity that allowed her to take the steps she had been avoiding for months. She contacted a discreet solicitor in London through carefully worded letters sent through a trusted maid, a Mr. and Blackwood, who specialized in delicate matters for the aristocracy and asked no uncomfortable questions, and over the course of several weeks they corresponded about the possibility of legal separation, the grounds that might be claimed, the settlements that would need to be arranged, and with each letter Eleanor felt simultaneously like she was murdering something precious and freeing herself from a prison of her own devotion. The divorce papers arrived on a grey morning in early April, delivered in a plain package that Eleanor opened with trembling hands in the privacy of her chambers. The legal documents rendered in impersonal script that reduced her marriage to clauses and conditions, and she read through them 3 times before placing them carefully in her writing desk, beside that unsent letter to her parents. These twin symbols of escape she had prepared but not yet deployed. For 2 days she carried the knowledge of those papers like a weight pressing on her chest, going through the motions of daily life, while internally gathering the courage for what she knew she must do. And on the 3rd day she requested through a servant that the Duke grant her a formal meeting in his study at 2 o'clock that afternoon, a request so unusual and properly phrased that Sebastian sent back immediate agreement, though Eleanor could imagine his confusion at the formality of it. She dressed with particular care that afternoon, choosing a simple gown of dove grey that made her look older and more severe, pinning her hair in a style that emphasized the seriousness of her purpose, and at precisely 2 o'clock she knocked on Sebastian's study door and entered at his bidding to find him standing beside his desk, his expression guarded and uncertain, clearly unsettled by this breach of their usual pattern of avoidance. Eleanor closed the door behind her and crossed to his desk with steady steps that belied the terror churning in her stomach, and without preamble she reached into the small portfolio she carried and withdrew the divorce papers, placing them on his desk with hands that shook only slightly, and when she spoke her voice was quiet but clear, each word carefully chosen and delivered with dignity that cost her everything. "You need an heir, Your Grace. I understand that. It is the foundation of our arrangement and the purpose of this marriage, but I cannot give you one while living as a ghost in your home, existing but not alive, present but unseen." She watched Sebastian's face go white as he stared at the papers, his hands gripping the edge of his desk as though he needed its support, but she forced herself to continue because, if she stopped, she would lose her courage entirely. "You deserve the freedom to find someone suitable, someone who can fulfill your needs without the complication of inconvenient feelings, and I deserve a life not spent loving someone who cannot, who will not love me in return. We both deserve better than this slow mutual destruction we have been engaged in." The words hung in the air between them, devastating in their calm rationality, and Eleanor saw Sebastian's throat work, as though he were trying to speak but could not form words, saw his hands trembling as they reached for the papers, and then pulled back as though they burned, and she felt a terrible urge to take back everything she had said, to tear up those papers herself and pretend this conversation had never happened. But she knew with absolute certainty that she could not, that her survival depended on this moment of courage. "I have made arrangements to return to my family's estate," she continued, her voice beginning to fracture despite her best efforts, "and I ask only that you consider these documents carefully and respond through your solicitor at your convenience. There is no urgency except that I cannot continue as we have been. I simply cannot." Sebastian finally looked up from the papers to her face, and Eleanor saw something in his eyes she had never seen before, something raw and desperate and utterly lost. But he said nothing, merely stood frozen behind his desk, staring at her as though she were speaking a language he could not comprehend. And Eleanor knew she had to leave now, immediately, before she broke entirely and threw herself at his feet, begging him to love her. So she offered him a small curtsy that felt like mockery of everything a curtsy should represent, and said quietly, "I will leave you to consider the matter in private. Your Grace," and she walked from the study with her head high and her back straight, closing the door softly behind her, and only when she reached the safety of her own chambers did she allow herself to collapse onto her bed and weep with great shaking sobs that seemed to tear themselves from somewhere deep in her chest, mourning not just the end of her marriage, but the death of every hope she had harbored that Sebastian might someday allow himself to love her. While 2 floors below in his study, Sebastian stood motionless, staring at the divorce papers on his desk, as though they were a sentence of execution, which, in a way, they were. Sebastian stood alone in his study long after Eleanor's footsteps had faded down the corridor, staring at the divorce papers on his desk, as though they were something incomprehensible, something that could not possibly be real, and his hands, when he finally reached for them, were shaking so violently he could barely grasp the pages, the legal language swimming before his eyes as he tried to focus on words that spelled out the end of everything, though he had not, until this moment, understood there was anything to end. He read through the documents once, twice, 3 times, each reading making the reality more concrete and more unbearable. The careful clauses about separation of property and future arrangements and grounds for dissolution, reducing their marriage to cold legal terminology that made no mention of the way Eleanor's eyes had looked when she placed these papers on his desk, the quiet devastation in her voice when she spoke of living as a ghost, the terrible dignity with which she had walked away from him, and Sebastian felt something cracking inside his chest, those carefully constructed walls he had spent a lifetime building beginning to fracture under a pressure he could no longer contain. He sank into his chair and dropped his head into his hands, the divorce papers falling from his fingers to scatter across the desk, and for the first time since his mother's death 20 years ago, Sebastian felt tears burning behind his eyes, hot and unwelcome and impossible to suppress, and he began to review with merciless clarity every moment of his marriage to Eleanor, every small kindness he had ignored, every gesture of warmth he had rebuffed, every opportunity for connection he had deliberately destroyed, because his father's voice still echoed in his mind, saying that love was weakness and vulnerability was death, and a duke must never allow his heart to rule his head. He remembered their wedding night when she had looked at him with something like hope in her eyes, and he had extinguished it with calculated coldness. Remembered the morning. He found her restoring his mother's garden and had walked away without thanking her. Remembered the dinner party where he had defended her honor to guests, but could not bring himself to show her the same warmth in private. Remembered watching her laugh with other men at the winter ball and feeling jealousy tear through him, but still saying nothing, doing nothing, allowing her to believe she meant nothing to him when the truth was she had become everything. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his heart pound with something between terror and desperate recognition, because he understood now what he had been too frightened to acknowledge before. He loved Eleanor, had perhaps loved her from the beginning, from that first night when she had accepted his cruelty with quiet dignity that shamed him, and every day since he had fallen deeper while building his walls higher, protecting himself from feeling while destroying the one person who might have saved him from becoming his father. Sebastian's gaze lifted to the portrait of his mother that hung above the fireplace, her gentle face looking down at him with an expression that seemed now like judgment, and he remembered with sudden visceral clarity how his father's coldness had slowly killed her spirit, how she had faded year by year into silence and depression until she simply gave up on living, and Sebastian saw with horrible insight that he had become exactly what he most hated, had inflicted on Eleanor the same slow death his father had inflicted on his mother. It had taken a warm, loving woman and turned her into a ghost through his deliberate emotional cruelty. The tears came then, hot and bitter, streaming down his face as he wept for his mother and for Eleanor and for himself, for all the wasted months and missed opportunities and the terrible possibility that he had realized the truth too late, that Eleanor was even now preparing to leave him, and he would spend the rest of his life alone in this vast empty house, with nothing but his pride and his walls, and the memory of what he had destroyed through cowardice. The night stretched on endlessly, as Sebastian sat in his study surrounded by darkness, the candles burning down to stubs, and the fire dying to embers, and he could not stop seeing Eleanor's face as she had looked that afternoon, the careful blankness that masked such deep pain, could not stop hearing her voice saying she deserved a life, not spent loving someone who could not love her back, and he wanted to scream that he did love her, that she was wrong, that he was capable of love even if he had never shown it. But the words felt hollow even in his own mind, because love without action was meaningless. Love hidden behind walls was indistinguishable from hatred, and he had given Eleanor no reason to believe his heart held anything but ice. As dawn began to lighten the windows, Sebastian understood with absolute clarity that Eleanor was not just his wife but his salvation, the one person who could save him from the cold, lonely existence his father had mapped out for him, and he was about to lose her through his own cowardice unless he could find the courage to tear down every wall he had ever built and offer her the one thing he had never given anyone, his whole broken, terrified heart. The morning arrived with pale spring sunlight filtering through the tall windows of Ashworth Manor, illuminating dust motes that drifted through empty corridors like tiny spirits, witnessing the end of an era, and Eleanor stood in her chambers surrounded by half-packed trunks and the remnants of a life she had tried to build in this vast cold house. her hands moving with mechanical efficiency as she folded gowns and wrapped small treasures in tissue paper. Each item, a memory of hope, gradually extinguished, until all that remained was this numb determination to save herself from complete erasure. She had sent word to her family's estate the previous evening, a brief letter informing them she would be arriving within the week and asking them to prepare her old rooms. And though she had not explained the circumstances, she knew her mother would understand the moment she saw Eleanor's face, would recognize the particular grief of a woman who had loved unwisely and lost everything in the loving, and the thought of her mother's embrace was the only comfort Eleanor could grasp as she continued her methodical packing. The household moved around her with unusual quietness, servants speaking in hushed voices as they passed her open door, their faces reflecting a sorrow that touched Eleanor despite her numbness, because these people had been kind to her when kindness was all she had treated her with warmth when her own husband offered only ice, and she would miss them more than she would miss these grand rooms that had never felt like home. As the morning clock struck 10, Eleanor closed the last trunk and stood surveying her chambers one final time. Memorizing details she knew she would never see again, the view of the gardens from her window, and the bookshelf she had filled with her favorite volumes, the writing desk where she had composed so many unsent letters, and she felt a wave of grief so intense it nearly brought her to her knees. But she steadied herself with one hand on the bedpost and reminded herself that she was choosing life over this slow death, choosing possibility over certain despair, and that such choices required the courage to walk away from even the things we love most. She descended the main staircase with her head high and her traveling cloak already fastened, her small valise in hand, while servants would follow with the trunks, and she was halfway down when she saw Sebastian standing at the bottom of the stairs, looking as though he had not slept or changed clothes since their meeting yesterday, his formal attire rumpled and his eyes red-rimmed and wild, and in his hands he held the divorce papers, except they were no longer intact, but torn into dozens of pieces that he clutched like a man drowning might clutch debris in a storm. Eleanor stopped on the stairs, her heart beginning to pound with something between hope and terror, and Sebastian looked up at her with an expression of such raw desperation. It was almost frightening as he said simply, hoarsely, "No," the single word echoing through the entrance hall, where several servants had frozen in their tasks to witness this unprecedented scene. Eleanor forced herself to continue descending until she stood 3 steps above him, using the height to maintain some small sense of control. Though her hands were shaking so badly, she had to grip her valise with both hands, and she said with as much steadiness as she could manage, "You cannot force me to stay. Your Grace, the law allows for separation, and I have made my choice. You have no right to—" But Sebastian interrupted her, his voice breaking as he said, "I know I have no right. I know I deserve nothing from you, but I am asking anyway, begging if I must, for you to hear me before you leave. Just hear me, Eleanor, please." The use of her Christian name, which he had never spoken before, struck her like a physical blow, and she found herself unable to move as Sebastian took a shaking breath and began to speak words that tumbled out, as though he had been holding them back for so long they could no longer be contained. "I have been a fool and a coward. I have treated you abominably. I have hidden behind duty and propriety and my father's poisoned teachings because I was terrified of what I felt for you, what I have felt since the beginning, though I was too frightened to name it, and I have let that fear destroy something precious and rare and irreplaceable. But the thought of losing you has broken something in me that I did not know could break. It has torn down every wall I built and left me with nothing but the truth I should have spoken months ago." Servants throughout the hall had stopped even pretending to work, standing motionless as they watched their duke, always so controlled, so proper, so coldly composed, come apart before their eyes, and Sebastian seemed not to notice or not to care as he took another step toward Eleanor and said, "I love you. I have loved you, perhaps from that first night when you showed me more grace than I deserved, and every day since I have fallen deeper, while convincing myself I was protecting us, both by maintaining distance, but I was only protecting my own cowardice, my own terror of becoming my father, or losing you the way my father lost my mother, and instead I have driven you away through the very coldness I swore I would never inflict on anyone. His voice broke completely, and he had to stop, tears streaming down his face unchecked as he struggled to continue. Eleanor stood frozen on the stairs, her own tears beginning to fall as Sebastian sank slowly to his knees on the marble floor, still clutching the torn papers, and said brokenly, "You are everything to me. You are my salvation and my hope, and the only light in this darkness I have lived in for so long. And I am not asking you to stay for an heir or for duty or for anything except that I need you, not as a duke needs a duchess, but as a drowning man needs air, and I will spend the rest of my life proving to you that I am capable of being the husband you deserve if you will only give me the chance. But if you cannot, if I have destroyed too much, then I will let you go because loving you means wanting your happiness, even if that happiness must be found away from me." The great entrance hall was utterly silent, except for the sound of Sebastian's ragged breathing and the quiet weeping of several servants who had witnessed their mistress's gentle sadness transform over months into this desperate ending. And Eleanor looked down at this proud, difficult man, kneeling before her with his heart finally, devastatingly exposed, and she felt something shift in her chest, some locked door beginning to open, despite every rational voice telling her to walk away, to protect herself, to refuse this sudden transformation that seemed too dramatic to be trusted. But as she looked into Sebastian's eyes, she saw not manipulation but truth, not performance but genuine anguish. And she understood that this moment was not an ending but a threshold, not a resolution but a beginning, fraught with uncertainty and risk, and the terrifying possibility of hope. Eleanor stood on the stairs looking down at Sebastian kneeling before her with his heart finally exposed, and though every rational part of her mind screamed that she should continue walking, should protect herself from further pain, should not trust this sudden transformation that seemed too dramatic to be believed, she found she could not move, could not speak, could only stare at this man who had caused her such deep suffering, now offering her everything she had ever wanted, but months too late, and the silence stretched between them until she finally found her voice and said quietly, carefully, "Sebastian, I cannot simply accept your words and pretend the past months did not happen. I cannot let one moment of passion erase all the loneliness and pain and slow death of hope I have endured in this house." She descended the final steps until she stood before him, looking down at his tear-stained face with a mixture of love and wariness that made her voice tremble as she continued. "You say you love me now, that you have loved me all along, but love without action is meaningless. Love hidden behind walls is indistinguishable from cruelty, and I have lived too long as a ghost in your home to simply trust that everything has changed because you have finally spoken the words I needed to hear months ago." Sebastian looked up at her with such raw anguish that Eleanor felt her resolve wavering, but she forced herself to continue, to protect the fragile remnants of her heart, even as it yearned to accept his confession, and she said, "I need time, I need proof. I need consistency rather than grand gestures that might fade when the fear of losing me subsides, because I deserve more than a husband who only values me when he thinks I might leave." The words seemed to strike Sebastian like physical blows, but he nodded slowly, rising from his knees with visible effort and saying hoarsely, "You are right. You deserve everything you have named and more, and I am asking only for the chance to prove myself, to show you through daily actions rather than desperate speeches that I am capable of being the husband you deserve. And if you will give me that chance, I swear I will spend every day earning your trust until you believe in my love as completely as I believe in it now." Eleanor studied his face, searching for any hint of manipulation or performance, but saw only genuine desperation and hope, and a vulnerability so complete it was almost frightening. And she found herself saying against all her better judgment, "I will not leave today. I will stay and give you the opportunity to prove your words with actions. But I cannot simply resume our marriage as though nothing has changed. I need space and time to heal from what has passed." Sebastian's relief was so profound he swayed slightly, gripping the banister for support as he said, "Thank you. God help me, Eleanor. Thank you. I will not fail you again. I swear it." And Eleanor felt tears streaming down her own face as she said, "The divorce is abandoned for now, but I will be moving to the West Wing, to chambers of my own, and you will court me, Sebastian. You will learn who I truly am and show me who you truly are. And only when I am certain will I consider returning to the life we should have built from the beginning." What followed in the weeks after that momentous morning was a transformation that seemed to astonish everyone who witnessed it, as Sebastian threw himself into the task of courting his own wife with a dedication and sincerity that slowly, gradually began to chip away at Eleanor's protective walls, and she woke each morning to find her rooms filled with white roses, her favorite flower, though she had never told him, and he must have asked the servants. And he appeared at breakfast each day asking if he might join her, and sitting across from her, speaking of books and current events, and carefully avoiding any pressure for intimacy or reconciliation. He accompanied her on her daily walks through the estate grounds, listening as she spoke of her thoughts and dreams, and quietly sharing pieces of his own carefully guarded history. And he took her to village fairs he once would have considered beneath his dignity, standing beside her as she examined ribbons and chatted with local families. And Eleanor watched this proud, difficult man, humbling himself daily for her sake, and felt her heart beginning to soften despite her determination to remain cautious, and beginning to believe that perhaps this change might be genuine, that perhaps the man kneeling before her on the stairs had been the truth, and the cold duke merely the armor. And as spring continued its slow bloom around them, Eleanor allowed herself the dangerous luxury of hope. As spring bloomed across the estate grounds, transforming bare branches into cascades of apple blossoms and filling the air with the scent of new growth, something equally profound bloomed between Sebastian and Eleanor, a tentative trust that deepened with each passing day, as they spent long hours walking the gardens together, speaking of things they had never dared voice before. And Sebastian began to share fragments of his childhood that explained so much of the man he had become, telling Eleanor about his father's cruel philosophy that emotion was weakness and love a liability, about watching his gentle mother slowly fade under the weight of her husband's coldness, until she died when Sebastian was barely 15, leaving him alone with a father who blamed him for not being strong enough to save her. And Eleanor listened with tears streaming down her face as she finally understood that Sebastian's walls had been built brick by brick throughout a childhood of systematic emotional destruction, that the cold duke she had married was not his true nature, but rather the armor a frightened boy had constructed to survive his father's brutality. In turn, Eleanor shared her own fears and dreams, speaking of her childhood love of stories and her secret hope that marriage might be like the romances she read about in books, admitting how devastated she had been on their wedding night, when Sebastian made clear she was nothing more than a means to an end. And Sebastian listened with visible pain, etching his features as he heard for the first time the full extent of the suffering he had caused, the slow death of hope he had inflicted through his determined coldness, and he apologized repeatedly, though Eleanor gently told him that apologies mattered less than actions, that she was watching not his words but his daily choices, and he seemed to understand and redoubled his efforts to prove himself worthy of the second chance she had granted. Sebastian arranged for Eleanor's family to visit, treating them with a warmth and respect that astonished them given what they had heard of his previous coldness, and Eleanor watched as he engaged her father in genuine conversation about estate management and complimented her mother on raising such a remarkable daughter, and she felt something in her chest loosening, some last defensive wall beginning to crumble, as she witnessed this proud, difficult man humbling himself for her sake. And at social gatherings, he began publicly acknowledging his wife's intelligence and worth, asking her opinions on matters of importance, and crediting her ideas when they proved valuable, and the transformation was remarked upon throughout the county as people whispered that the Duke of Ashworth had apparently fallen in love with his own wife. One evening in late spring, as the sun set over the restored garden that had become their favorite refuge, Sebastian asked Eleanor to sit with him on the stone bench beneath the rose arbor, and from his coat pocket he withdrew a leather-bound journal that he placed in her hands with trembling fingers. And when Eleanor opened it, she found page after page of his careful handwriting, documenting small observations about her, moments he had noticed and cherished without ever letting her know, entries dating back to their wedding day, describing the grace with which she had endured his coldness, the kindness she showed to servants, the way she bit her lip when concentrating on a difficult passage in a book, the sound of her rare laughter, the strength she demonstrated in demanding more than he had been willing to give. And as Eleanor read through this chronicle of love unacknowledged, she began to weep, because here was proof that even in his coldest moments he had been paying attention. He had been falling in love, though he lacked the courage to act on it. And Sebastian sat beside her in anxious silence until she finally looked up at him with tears still streaming down her face and said, "You saw all of this, you felt all of this, and yet you let me suffer thinking I meant nothing to you." And he nodded miserably and said, "I was a coward. I am still a coward except in this one thing. I am brave enough now to tell you that I love you, that I have always loved you, that you are the best thing that ever happened to me, and I will spend my life proving it, if you will let me." And Eleanor reached out and took his hand, really took it for the first time with intention and desire rather than mere duty, and she said, "Then prove it, Sebastian, not with grand gestures but with every small daily choice. Prove it until I can believe it without reservation." And he raised her hand to his lips and kissed it with a reverence that made her breath catch, and as the last light faded from the sky, they sat together in the garden his mother had loved, two people who had begun as strangers, bound by obligation, now choosing each other with full hearts and open eyes. And when Sebastian finally drew Eleanor into his arms and kissed her, it was not the cold mechanical touch of duty, but the passionate, desperate kiss of a man who had nearly lost everything, and now held his entire world in his embrace. And Eleanor kissed him back with equal passion, equal desperation, equal hope, and that night when they came together in Sebastian's chambers, it was not about heirs or obligations, but about genuine desire and love, and the profound relief of two souls finally connecting in the way they should have from the beginning. And afterwards, as they lay tangled together in the darkness, Eleanor whispered, "I think I can believe in us now. I think I can trust this." And Sebastian held her tighter and promised, "You can trust this. You can trust me. I will never again give you reason to doubt." And Eleanor let herself believe him, let herself hope, let herself finally, cautiously, completely fall into the love she had been guarding her heart against. And spring continued its gentle bloom around them as they began to build together the marriage they should have had all along. Summer arrived with golden warmth that seemed to mirror the transformation blooming within the estate's walls, and Sebastian and Eleanor's relationship deepened into something neither had dared imagine possible during those cold early months of their marriage. A true partnership built on mutual respect and genuine affection that grew stronger with each passing day. And they spent long mornings in the library debating literature and philosophy, with Eleanor challenging Sebastian's interpretations and Sebastian delighting in her sharp intellect, their conversations evolving from tentative exchanges to passionate discussions where they could disagree without fear and laugh at their own stubbornness. And in the afternoons they walked the estate together, reviewing account books and discussing improvements with Eleanor's suggestions about tenant welfare, proving so valuable that Sebastian began to wonder how he had ever managed without her insights. And the transformation in Sebastian was remarked upon by everyone who encountered him, as the cold, forbidding duke seemed to have vanished, entirely replaced by a man who smiled easily and engaged warmly with both family and staff, who could be found laughing at dinner rather than sitting in stern silence, who spoke of his wife with such obvious devotion that it made some of the older servants weep with joy to witness it. And Eleanor bloomed as well into a woman no longer quiet and sad but confident and radiant, secure in her husband's love in a way that changed how she moved through the world. And one afternoon in late summer, Sebastian asked Eleanor to accompany him on a walk with a particular destination in mind, though he would not say where they were going, and she followed him through the estate grounds to a small chapel she had never visited before, beyond which lay a private cemetery where generations of Ashworths rested beneath ancient trees, and Sebastian led her to a simple grave marker bearing his mother's name and dates that showed she had died far too young, and Eleanor watched as Sebastian knelt before the grave, with tears streaming down his face. This proud, difficult man, who had hidden his emotions for so long, now openly weeping, and he spoke aloud to his mother's memory, saying, "Mother, I have brought Eleanor to meet you, the woman who saved me from becoming father, who showed me that love is not weakness but the greatest strength, and I promise you that I will honor your memory by being the husband father never was, by building a home filled with warmth rather than coldness, and by choosing love every day for the rest of my life." And Eleanor knelt beside him, placing her hand over his as her own tears fell, moved beyond words by this gesture of trust and vulnerability, and they stayed there together until the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the graves. And when they finally returned to the house, something between them had shifted again into an even deeper intimacy, and that night when they came together in their shared chambers, the connection was different from anything before. not the passionate relief of their first true union, but something quieter and more profound, a merging of souls rather than merely bodies. And afterwards, as they lay tangled together in the darkness, Sebastian whispered, "I never knew it could be like this, that marriage could be partnership and friendship and passion all woven together." And Eleanor kissed him softly and said, "Neither did I, but we have built it together from ruins, and it is more beautiful for having been earned." And as summer continued its slow progression toward autumn, they dreamed together about their future, about children perhaps, and growing old together, and all the years stretching ahead filled with this precious intimacy they had fought so hard to achieve. Early autumn arrived with a whisper of change, as leaves began their slow transformation from green to gold, and it was during this season of transition that Eleanor discovered she was with child, the news delivered by the estate physician on a crisp morning that seemed to shimmer with possibility. And when Eleanor told Sebastian, she watched his face carefully, uncertain how he would react, given their tumultuous history and his original declaration that he needed an heir, not a wife. But what she witnessed was not the cold satisfaction she might once have expected, but rather pure, unfiltered joy that transformed his features into something almost boyish, his eyes bright with tears as he pulled her into his arms and whispered, "Eleanor, my love, this is the most precious gift." And then immediately his joy gave way to tender concern as he pulled back to look at her with sudden anxiety, asking if she felt well, if she needed to sit down, if the physician had given specific instructions about her care. And Eleanor laughed softly at this dramatic shift from passionate embrace to worried hovering, finding his sudden protectiveness endearing rather than suffocating. And in the weeks that followed, Sebastian became almost comically attentive to Eleanor's every need, insisting she rest more often than necessary, bringing her cushions when she sat in the library, personally selecting the finest foods for her meals, and consulting with the cook about proper nutrition for expectant mothers. And Eleanor watched this man who had once been so determinedly cold, now fussing over her with such obvious devotion that she sometimes had to hide her smile behind her hand. And they spent long evenings in the nursery that had stood empty and unused since Sebastian's own childhood, working together to transform it from a dusty, forgotten room into a warm, welcoming space filled with light and hope. And as they selected fabrics for curtains and discussed where the cradle should be placed, they also spoke about names, Sebastian favoring Catherine for a girl after his mother, while Eleanor suggested strong classic names for a boy. And during one particularly tender moment, as they sat together on the floor of the half-finished nursery, surrounded by swatches of fabric and paint samples, Sebastian confessed his deepest fear, saying, "What if I become my father? What if I fail our child the way he failed me? What if I do not know how to show love because I was never shown it myself?" And Eleanor took his face in her hands and looked into his eyes with such certainty that he could not doubt her as she said, "You have already proven yourself capable of extraordinary change. You chose love when it would have been easier to remain closed. You broke down walls built over a lifetime, and that same courage will make you a wonderful father." And Sebastian seemed to draw strength from her words, from her unwavering faith in him. And one evening, as the sun set beyond the nursery windows, painting the room in shades of amber and rose, Sebastian knelt beside Eleanor's chair and placed his hand gently on her growing belly, and he began to speak softly to their unborn child, making promises about the home they would create together, about bedtime stories and patient guidance and unconditional love, about never making their child feel that emotions were weakness or that affection must be earned. And Eleanor watched through tears as this man who had once declared he needed an heir, not a wife, now whispered to their baby about how wanted and cherished they would be, how their mother was the bravest, strongest woman in the world, and their father would spend every day trying to be worthy of the family he had been given. And the contrast between Sebastian then and Sebastian now was so profound that Eleanor felt her heart might burst with the weight of her love for him. And as autumn deepened toward winter, and Eleanor's belly grew round with their child, Sebastian remained constantly at her side, reading to her from her favorite books, walking with her through the gardens when the physician said gentle exercise was beneficial, holding her through moments of discomfort with such tenderness that she sometimes wept simply from the overwhelming feeling of being so completely loved and protected, and the entire estate seemed to share in their joy. As servants smiled to see the Duke so transformed, so devoted, so utterly besotted with his wife and their coming child, and Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as true partners, as lovers, as the family they had fought so hard to become. The pregnancy progressed through winter and into early spring, with Eleanor growing more radiant despite the physical discomforts, and Sebastian remained steadfastly at her side, refusing to travel for business or attend social events that would take him away from her for more than a few hours, and he read to her each evening from her favorite novels, while she reclined against pillows he had arranged with meticulous care, and he personally consulted with the cook about preparing dishes that might ease her occasional nausea or satisfy her changing appetites, bringing her candied ginger when mornings were difficult and fresh strawberries when she craved something sweet, and the estate staff watched this transformation with wonder, speaking among themselves about how the fearsome Duke had become the most devoted husband any of them had ever witnessed, and old friends who visited barely recognized the warm, attentive man Sebastian had become, Lord Pemberton remarking to his wife that he had known Sebastian since childhood and never imagined him capable of such tenderness. And one mild April evening, when Eleanor was in her 8th month and moving more slowly with the weight of their child, she stood at the nursery window, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and gold, and Sebastian came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms gently around her and resting his hands on her swollen belly, and they stood there in peaceful silence until Eleanor suddenly gasped and doubled over with a pain that sent immediate terror through Sebastian's heart, and he called for servants to fetch the physician and the midwife while he helped Eleanor to their bedchamber, his hands shaking as he tried to remain calm for her sake, though inside he was fracturing with fear, and the midwife arrived quickly examining Eleanor and declaring with concern that the baby was coming early, several weeks before expected. And what followed were hours of agonizing waiting as Sebastian paced outside the birthing chamber, listening to Eleanor's cries of pain and feeling utterly helpless. This man who had always controlled everything, now powerless to ease his beloved wife's suffering, and he found himself praying desperately to a God he had largely ignored since childhood, making fervent promises that if Eleanor and their child survived, he would be worthy of such mercy forever, that he would never again take for granted the precious gift of love she had given him. And the night stretched endlessly with Sebastian's fear growing, as the physician's face became increasingly grave and hushed. Urgent voices carried through the door, and Sebastian thought he might go mad from the terror of potentially losing Eleanor, of having finally found love only to have it torn away, and he leaned against the wall with tears streaming down his face, whispering, "Please, please let her live. I cannot exist in a world without her." And then, just as dawn began to break through the windows, there came the thin wail of an infant, followed by terrible silence that made Sebastian's heart stop, and he burst through the door without permission to find the midwife holding a tiny baby girl, while the physician worked frantically over Eleanor's still form, and Sebastian rushed to Eleanor's side, taking her hand and calling her name with desperate urgency, and after what felt like an eternity, her eyes fluttered open and she whispered, "Sebastian, it is our daughter well." And his relief was so overwhelming that he could barely speak, as he assured her that yes, their baby was perfect and healthy. And when the midwife placed the small warm bundle in his arms, Sebastian looked down at his daughter's tiny face and felt his entire world shift, and he carried her carefully to Eleanor's bedside so she could see this miracle they had created. And as Eleanor reached up to touch their daughter's downy hair, Sebastian whispered with a voice thick with emotion, "You gave me everything, Eleanor, love, hope, purpose, the courage to become someone worthy of such gifts, and I see now that the heir was never what I needed. You were always what I needed. You and this family we have built together from the ruins of what I thought my life must be." And Eleanor smiled through her exhaustion and said, "And you gave me a love I thought existed only in stories. Sebastian, you became the man I always believed you could be." And they sat there together as morning light filled the room, parents now, their daughter sleeping peacefully between them, and Sebastian knew that this moment was the truest beginning of the life he had almost been too afraid to claim. The months following Catherine's birth transformed the Ashworth estate into something it had never been before, a place of warmth and laughter and tender domesticity, and Sebastian became a father unlike any the household had ever witnessed, often found in the nursery at all hours, Cradling his tiny daughter against his chest and singing old lullabies, he remembered from his own mother's rare moments of happiness. And when servants offered to change Catherine or soothe her crying, he would shake his head with a gentle smile and say that he wished to do these things himself, that he had spent too much of his life avoiding connection and would not miss a single moment with his child. And Eleanor watched this transformation with quiet, profound joy, seeing the cold, distant duke she had married become this devoted, loving presence, who spoke to their daughter in soft tones about everything from the weather to the books he planned to read to her when she was older, and they named her Catherine after Sebastian's mother, in a christening ceremony that became far more than a religious observance, but rather a celebration of new beginnings and second chances. And Sebastian stood before their gathered friends and family, holding his daughter with such obvious love as he gave a speech that brought tears to many eyes, thanking Eleanor publicly for saving him from the half-life he had been living, for teaching him that true strength lay not in walls and distance but in vulnerability and openness, for showing him that love was not weakness, but rather the greatest legacy a man could leave. And as he spoke, Eleanor saw several guests dabbing at their eyes, while others smiled with genuine warmth at this couple who had somehow found their way from a cold arrangement to this deep, abiding partnership. And when Sebastian finished speaking, he looked directly at Eleanor across the room, and the understanding that passed between them needed no words, a shared acknowledgement of how far they had traveled together, and how grateful they both were to have persevered through the darkness to reach this light. And in the months that followed, life settled into a peaceful rhythm of family breakfasts, where Sebastian would make faces at Catherine to elicit her gurgles of delight, of evening walks through the estate grounds, with Eleanor carrying their daughter and Sebastian pointing out the flowers and trees and birds, as though Catherine could understand his gentle narration of quiet moments in the nursery, where they would stand together, watching their child sleep and marveling at the miracle of her existence. And the entire household remarked on the change not just in the Duke, but in the very atmosphere of the estate, which had once been cold and formal and was now filled with the sounds of infant laughter and parents' soft voices and the general contentment that comes from a house built on genuine love rather than mere duty. And Eleanor would sometimes catch Sebastian simply staring at her, and Catherine with an expression of such wonder and gratitude that she knew he was still amazed by what they had built together, still grateful every day that she had been brave enough to demand more than he thought he could give, and that he had been brave enough to try to become worthy of such demands. And as their first year, as parents drew to a close and Catherine grew from a tiny infant into a baby with her father's dark hair and her mother's gentle eyes, Sebastian would often whisper to Eleanor in the quiet darkness of their shared bedchamber that he had finally found the purpose he had searched for his entire life, that it was not in heirs or duty or preserving a legacy, but rather in this simple, profound act of loving and being loved in return. 2 years passed like the turning of pages in a beloved book, each season bringing new chapters of joy and growth to the Ashworth estate, and the transformation that had begun with Sebastian's tearful confession on the grand staircase had deepened into something far more profound than either of them could have imagined. For the estate now thrived under their joint management, with Sebastian consulting Eleanor on every major decision, and Eleanor bringing her intelligence and compassion to matters of tenant welfare and land stewardship, and they had been blessed with a son named James, who arrived on a crisp October morning with his father's dark eyes and a lusty cry that announced his presence to the entire household. And Catherine had grown into a bright, curious toddler of 2 who followed her father everywhere with devoted adoration, reaching up her small arms to be carried and chattering in her half-formed words about flowers and birds and everything that caught her wandering attention. And the family was often seen together in the gardens or on the grounds, or in the village where Sebastian and Eleanor had established themselves as generous benefactors, supporting local causes and treating everyone from the highest nobility to the humblest tenant with equal respect and kindness. And Sebastian had become known throughout the county, not for the cold severity that had once defined him, but rather for his generosity and fairness, and above all for his obvious devotion to his family. And Eleanor had established several charitable initiatives, including a school for local children, where she taught reading twice a week, and a restoration project for the village church that had fallen into disrepair. And they worked together as true partners in every sense, discussing estate matters over breakfast while Catherine played with her wooden blocks, and James nursed contentedly in Eleanor's arms, debating the merits of new agricultural techniques during afternoon walks, planning improvements to tenant cottages in the quiet evenings after the children were asleep. And one particular autumn afternoon, when the leaves were turning gold and crimson and the air held that peculiar clarity that comes before winter, Eleanor was in their private sitting room, sorting through correspondence while Sebastian played on the floor with Catherine, building towers of blocks for her to knock down with gleeful shrieks. And as Eleanor reached for a small wooden box on the shelf, where she kept important documents, her hand brushed against something she had not looked at in 2 years. And when Sebastian glanced up from his play, he saw her holding torn pieces of paper with an expression he could not quite read, and he rose and crossed to her, asking what she had found. And Eleanor looked up at him with eyes that held both shadows of old pain and the light of present joy, as she said quietly, "The divorce papers. I kept them." And Sebastian felt his heart contract as he took the fragments from her hands and asked why she would preserve such a painful memory, and Eleanor smiled with that particular gentleness she had developed over their years together, and explained, "They remind me of the day everything changed, Sebastian, the day you chose love over pride, the day you proved that people can transform if they find the courage to try. They are not a symbol of what we almost lost, but rather of what we found." And Sebastian looked down at the torn pieces that represented the moment his entire life had hung in the balance, the moment he had finally broken through his own walls, and he thought of all that had come since: the love, the children, the partnership, the profound happiness that filled every corner of what had once been such a cold and empty house. And he carried the pieces to the fireplace where a small fire burned against the autumn chill, and he held them out to Eleanor in silent question, and she nodded with understanding, and together they fed the fragments to the flames, watching as that painful chapter of their lives turned to ash and smoke, the physical remnants of their near tragedy consumed by fire, while the lessons remained forever written on their hearts. And as the last piece blackened and disappeared, Sebastian pulled Eleanor close and whispered, "We have no need for reminders of what we almost lost, my love, when every day I wake beside you is a reminder of what we found." And Eleanor leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid warmth of him and listening to Catherine's happy babbling and James's soft sounds from his cradle, and she thought how strange and wonderful it was that the coldest arrangement had led to the warmest love, that the man who had once needed only an heir had become the devoted husband and father she had always dreamed of. And as the ashes of the divorce papers settled in the grate, they stood together, looking toward a future that stretched bright and unlimited before them. A future built not on duty or obligation, but on the transformative power of choosing love, even when, especially, when such choice required the courage to change everything. 5 years had passed since the torn divorce papers had turned to ash in the fireplace, and the Ashworth estate, on this particular June afternoon, bore no resemblance whatsoever to the cold, forbidding place it had been a decade earlier, for the grounds were filled with the sounds of children's laughter and music from a small ensemble, and the cheerful chatter of guests who had come to celebrate Catherine's 7th birthday, and colourful bunting stretched between the ancient oak trees, while tables laden with cakes and sweets and delicate sandwiches dotted the lawn, and children in their finest clothes ran through the gardens, playing games of tag and hide and seek among the rose bushes that Eleanor had so lovingly restored years ago. And Sebastian stood near the terrace, watching the festivities with an expression of such profound contentment that several old friends who remembered the severe cold duke he had once been found themselves marveling at the transformation, and Eleanor moved through the celebration with natural grace, greeting guests and ensuring the children were happy, and occasionally catching Sebastian's eye across the lawn and exchanging smiles that held entire conversations of love and shared joy. And they were now in their late 30s, with Sebastian's dark hair showing distinguished threads of silver at the temples, and Eleanor's beauty having matured into something deeper and more radiant than mere youth could provide. And when they came together in the afternoon sunshine, and Sebastian took Eleanor's hand in his with the casual intimacy of long-married lovers, Lady Pemberton remarked to her husband that she had never in all her years seen a couple more devoted or more clearly in love. And as the celebration continued into the golden evening, and the children were finally tucked into beds throughout the estate, exhausted from their playing, Sebastian and Eleanor found themselves alone in the library, where so much of their early painful distance had played out, and Eleanor settled into the chair by the window where she had once sat reading in solitude, while her husband ignored her existence. And Sebastian crossed the room not to his desk, where he had once barricaded himself behind work and duty, but rather to kneel beside her chair, much as he had knelt on the grand staircase 5 years earlier, and from his pocket he drew a small velvet box, which he opened to reveal a ring of extraordinary beauty. Diamonds and sapphires set in gold that caught the lamplight and scattered it in brilliant fragments. And Eleanor looked from the ring to Sebastian's face with questioning eyes, and he took her left hand gently and looked at the simple band she still wore, the cold obligatory ring he had given her on their wedding day, which she had never removed, despite its lack of sentiment. And Sebastian said quietly, his voice rough with emotion, "Marry me again, Eleanor. Not for heirs or duty or family obligation, but for love. Let me vow again, this time with my whole heart, and let this ring replace that cold symbol of what we began with. Let it represent what we have become." And Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes as she looked at this man who had traveled so far from the icebound duke who had once declared he needed an heir, not a wife. And she whispered yes through her tears, and Sebastian slipped the new ring onto her finger beside the old one, and then gently removed that first ring, that reminder of coldness and duty, and he held it for a moment before setting it aside, and Eleanor looked at her hand adorned now with this beautiful declaration of love, and she pulled Sebastian up from his kneeling position into her arms, and they held each other in the quiet library, surrounded by books and memories both painful and precious, and Sebastian murmured against her hair, "You have given me everything, my love, a life worth living, children who will never know the coldness I knew, a purpose beyond mere duty." And Eleanor drew back to look into his face and said softly, "And you gave me the courage to demand my worth, to believe that transformation is possible, to trust that love can bloom even in the coldest soil." And they sat together as the night deepened outside the windows, planning a quiet vow renewal ceremony, dreaming of the years ahead, and grateful beyond measure for the path that had led them from such darkness into this profound and abiding light. They held the vow renewal ceremony on a perfect September morning, when the light fell through the stained glass windows of the estate's small chapel in shafts of ruby and sapphire and gold, and the intimate space held only their children and their closest friends. Perhaps 20 souls in total who had witnessed some portion of their remarkable journey, from cold arrangement to profound love, and Catherine at 7 years old stood as her mother's attendant, wearing a dress of pale blue silk and holding a small bouquet of roses from the garden her father had restored for her grandmother's memory, and James at 5 stood solemnly beside his father, trying to mirror Sebastian's posture, and failing only because he could not contain his excited squirming. And when Eleanor entered the chapel on the arm of her own father, who had travelled from the family estate for this occasion, she wore not white but a gown of deep burgundy that brought out the warmth in her complexion and made her look like something between an autumn sunset and a fine wine. And Sebastian, standing at the altar, felt his breath catch just as it had on their first wedding day, though for entirely different reasons now. For then he had seen only duty and obligation, but now he saw the woman who had saved him from himself, who had demanded he become more than the cold shell his father's cruelty had made him, who had given him children and purpose, and a reason to greet each morning with gratitude rather than grim determination. And when she reached him and took his hands in hers, their eyes met and held with such intensity of feeling that several guests found themselves reaching for handkerchiefs before the vows had even begun. And the elderly vicar, who had married them the first time in that cold formal ceremony a decade earlier, now smiled with genuine warmth as he invited Sebastian to speak his vows, and Sebastian's voice, though it had commanded ballrooms and parliamentary chambers and estate meetings, trembled slightly as he began. "Eleanor, 10 years ago I stood in this very place and promised you my name, my protection, my duty, but I did not promise you my heart, because I believed I had none to give. I was a man encased in ice, convinced that coldness was strength, and that love was the weakness that had destroyed my mother, and I brought you into a prison of my own making and expected you to live there quietly without complaint. And you did live there, with grace and dignity that shamed me, though I refused to acknowledge it. until the day you had the courage to hand me divorce papers and tell me you deserved more than half a life, and that day you shattered every wall I had built. You forced me to see that I was not protecting myself but destroying us both. And Eleanor, you gave me a life beyond mere existence. You taught me that strength lies not in walls, but in the courage to tear them down. You showed me that love is not weakness but the greatest power we possess, and you have given me children who will never know the coldness I knew, who will grow up understanding that vulnerability is brave, and that choosing love, even when it terrifies you, is the most important choice anyone can make. And so today I vow to you, not from duty but from devotion, not because I need an heir, but because I need you. I need your laugh and your wisdom and your patience and your fire. I vow to spend every remaining day of my life proving myself worthy of the second chance you gave me. I vow to love you, not just in the easy moments, but in the difficult ones, and to choose you every day, as you chose to give me another opportunity when you had every right to walk away. And I vow to our children, and to God, and to everyone here that you will never again doubt your worth or my devotion, for you are everything, my love, my partner, my salvation. And by the time he finished, there were tears streaming down Eleanor's face, and half the guests were weeping openly, including the vicar himself, and Eleanor gathered herself and spoke her own vows with a voice that rang clear and strong through the chapel. Sebastian, when I married you, I was young and frightened, and I believed that a quiet, dignified suffering was all I could expect from an arranged marriage. I had dreams of love and partnership, but I had resigned myself to living without them, and for months I did live in that resignation, watching you from a distance, seeing glimpses of the man beneath the ice and loving you despite knowing you could not or would not love me in return. And when I finally found the courage to present you with those divorce papers, it was not because I had stopped loving you, but because I loved myself enough to know I deserved more, and you gave me more. Sebastian, you became more. You found the courage to break yourself open and show me the wounded heart you had protected for so long, and you have spent every day since then proving that transformation is possible, that people can change if they want to badly enough, and you have given me a partnership I never dreamed possible, a love that grows deeper with each passing year, children who are the most precious gifts of our union, and a life filled with purpose and joy, and the kind of peace that comes only from being truly known and truly loved. And so I vow to you today what I have vowed in my heart for years now. I vow to walk beside you through whatever years we are granted, to love you in sunshine and in storm, to be your partner in all things, to remind you when old fears surface that you are not the cold duke anymore, but the warm, devoted man you chose to become. And I vow to our children that they will always see in us an example of love that endures, because both people choose it daily. And Sebastian, my love, I vow that I will never stop being grateful that you tore up those papers and chose us, chose this, chose love. And when the vicar pronounced them renewed in their vows, Sebastian pulled Eleanor into his arms and kissed her with such passion and tenderness combined that young Catherine giggled and James made a face of childish disgust that made the guests laugh through their tears. And afterwards there was a small celebration in the estate's drawing room, where their children presented them with drawings they had made. Catherine's showing the family and the garden with remarkable detail for her age, James's a more abstract representation that nonetheless clearly depicted 4 figures holding hands, and Sebastian held Eleanor close throughout the afternoon, whispering promises in her ear about the years to come, about growing old together, about watching their children grow and perhaps welcoming more children if they were so blessed, about the legacy of love they would build together. And that night when the guests had departed and the children were asleep and the house had settled into quiet, Sebastian and Eleanor sat in the library where so much of their story had unfolded, and they talked about the future with the ease of people who trusted completely in each other and in what they had built, and the happiness that surrounded them was not the giddy excitement of new love, but something far more valuable, the deep, abiding contentment of love that had been tested and proven, love that had survived coldness and distance and near destruction, to emerge stronger and more beautiful than either of them could have imagined. And as the fire burned low and the candles guttered, they made their way upstairs together, hand in hand, to the chambers they now shared, and Eleanor looked at the new ring on her finger beside the simple band she had chosen to keep wearing as well, and she thought how perfectly it symbolized their journey, The cold beginning and the warm transformation, both part of their story, both necessary to bring them to this moment of complete and perfect love. 10 years had passed since the torn divorce papers had scattered across the study floor like snow, and the transformation of both the Duke of Ashworth and his estate had become the stuff of local legend, whispered about in village taverns and discussed in London drawing rooms as proof that even the coldest heart could thaw if given reason enough. And on this particular evening in late September, as golden light slanted across the grounds, Catherine stood at the edge of the gardens at 17 years old, a young woman of remarkable grace and intelligence who carried her mother's quiet dignity and her father's sharp mind, preparing to leave for her first term at a ladies' academy, where she would study literature and philosophy much as her mother had once done in lonely solitude. And James at 15 moved through the estate, with the thoughtful deliberation of a boy becoming a man, already showing interest in estate management and often found in deep discussion with his father about tenant welfare and agricultural improvements. And in the nursery, two younger children, Margaret aged 6 and William aged 4, filled the rooms with laughter and the kind of chaos that would have horrified the cold Duke Sebastian had once been. But that now made him smile with deep contentment, and Sebastian himself at 47 had silver threaded liberally through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that came from years of smiling rather than frowning, and he moved through the world with a warmth that still surprised those who had known him in his icebound years. And Eleanor at 44 had grown, if anything, more beautiful with time, her face showing the gentle marks of a life well lived and deeply loved, and she radiated a contentment so profound that visitors to the estate often remarked on the peaceful atmosphere that seemed to emanate from the Duchess herself. And the estate under their joint stewardship had become not merely prosperous but beloved, known throughout the county for its fair treatment of tenants, its charitable works, its support of local schools and orphanages, and the village that lay in its shadow had grown and thrived in ways that would have seemed impossible during the cold reign of Sebastian's father. And on this anniversary evening, 15 years to the day since their first cold wedding, Sebastian and Eleanor walked together through the restored garden where his mother's roses bloomed in profusion, their hands intertwined with the casual intimacy of long partnership, and they moved in comfortable silence for a time, simply being together as they had learned to be over years of patient work and deep commitment, until they reached the stone bench beneath the old oak tree, where they often sat in the evenings, and Eleanor settled onto the worn stone, while Sebastian remained standing for a moment, looking back at the house where warm light spilled from windows and the sounds of their children's voices drifted on the autumn air, and he said quietly, "Do you remember the first time I found you in this garden, when you had restored it without my asking, when I said nothing but felt everything?" And Eleanor smiled and drew him down beside her and replied, "I remember every moment, Sebastian, the cold ones and the warm ones, the distance and the drawing together, all of it necessary to bring us here." And Sebastian took her hand and studied it, the new ring he had given her 5 years ago, gleaming beside the simple band she had never removed, despite its origins in obligation rather than love. And he said with the vulnerability that had become natural to him over years of practice, "Thank you for refusing to give up on me, for having the courage to hand me those papers and demand I become more than the shell I had made of myself, and for teaching me that true strength lies not in walls but in the courage to tear them down." And Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder and said softly, "And thank you for being brave enough to break and to let yourself feel. To choose love when every instinct your father had beaten into you told you it was weakness." And they sat together as the sun sank lower and painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, and Sebastian said almost to himself, "I needed an heir, I thought. That was all I needed. But what I needed was you. What I needed was to learn that love is not the death of strength, but its very foundation." And Eleanor lifted her head to look at him and said, "The pain was necessary, wasn't it? We could not have this depth of joy without first knowing that depth of sorrow." And Sebastian nodded and pulled her closer, and they sat in the gathering dusk, watching as stars began to appear one by one in the darkening sky. And from the house they heard Catherine calling for them that dinner was ready, her voice carrying the same musical quality her mother's had. And they rose together and walked hand in hand back toward the warm light and the laughter and the life they had built together from the ashes of a cold arrangement. completely at peace with the journey that had brought them from strangers to soulmates, from duty to devotion, from ice to this profound and abiding warmth. The years continued their steady march forward, and when Sebastian reached his 68th year and Eleanor her 60th, the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth had become something of a legend, not merely in their county, but throughout England. Spoken of in parlours and at social gatherings as the couple who had transformed a cold arranged marriage into a love story that had endured and deepened across decades, and the estate that had once been known for its forbidding atmosphere and cold duke now radiated warmth from every window and garden path. And on a particular autumn afternoon, when golden light slanted through the library windows in the way it had for 50 years, Sebastian and Eleanor sat in their favourite chairs, surrounded by an abundance of grandchildren, ranging from Catherine's eldest daughter of 16 to James's youngest son of barely 3 years, and the children climbed over their grandparents with the easy affection of those who had never known coldness or distance, and Catherine herself, now a woman of 35 with her mother's grace and her father's sharp intelligence, sat nearby with her husband, watching her parents with a smile that held deep gratitude for the example they had set, and James at 33 managed the estate with the same fairness and warmth his father had learned to show, and Margaret and William, both married now with families of their own and had chosen their spouses for love, having witnessed firsthand what such love could create, and the library shelves held not only the ancient volumes that had been there in Sebastian's cold years, but also newer books, children's books, journals filled with family history and stories, and on one particular shelf in a place of honor sat a wooden box that held the torn fragments of divorce papers that had never been signed, papers that had become family legend. The moment when everything changed, when a duke chose love over pride, and a duchess chose to give him the chance to prove his transformation, and Sebastian's hair was now entirely silver, and his face deeply lined, but his eyes still held that warmth that had replaced the ice so many decades ago, and Eleanor's beauty had only deepened with age, her face showing the gentle marks of a life filled with laughter and love and purpose. And as the afternoon wore on, and the grandchildren were called away by their parents for various activities, Sebastian and Eleanor found themselves alone in the library once more, and they looked at each other across the space that separated their chairs, and something passed between them, some communication that needed no words after 46 years of marriage, and Sebastian rose with the careful movements of age and crossed to Eleanor's chair and extended his hand, and she took it and rose, and together they walked to the window that overlooked the gardens where his mother's roses still bloomed and where they had spent countless hours over the decades. And Sebastian said quietly, "We built something beautiful, didn't we, from the ashes of that cold beginning?" And Eleanor leaned against him and replied, "We built everything, my love. A family, a legacy, a love that our children and grandchildren will carry forward." And they stood together watching the gardens in the fading light, and then the scene seemed to shift, to pull back, to release them to their private peace, and a voice emerged as if speaking directly to those who had witnessed their story, saying, "Dear listener, you have walked with Sebastian and Eleanor through their journey from ice to warmth, from duty to devotion, from a marriage that existed only in name, to a love that transformed not only 2 hearts, but generations that followed. And their story teaches us that sometimes the greatest love stories begin in the coldest of circumstances, that true change requires courage from both hearts, one to demand their worth and refuse to settle for half love, another to recognize that worth and be brave enough to break down walls that seemed impenetrable. And may you remember as you go about your own life that it is never too late to choose love over pride, never too late to fall to your knees and admit you were wrong, never too late to tear up the papers that would end your chance at happiness, and instead fight for the love you nearly destroyed, through fear, and may you have the strength to know your value and never accept less than you deserve. May you find someone brave enough to choose growth over comfort, vulnerable enough to show you their wounds, committed enough to prove their transformation through patient daily acts of love, and may you build your own legacy, not of coldness and duty, but of warmth and devotion, and the kind of love that endures through decades and teaches the next generation what is truly possible when 2 people choose each other every day. And as Sebastian and Eleanor spend their final years in the peace they earned through pain and patience and courage, may your own heart know such peace, may your own love story, whatever form it takes, lead you toward the profound contentment that comes from being truly known and truly loved. And may you sleep tonight with hope in your heart and the knowledge that transformation is always possible for those brave enough to choose it. From Loving Soul Stories. And may you subscribe and like and share these stories with others who need to hear that love can heal even the deepest wounds. And may your dreams be filled with the warmth that Sebastian and Eleanor found together, the warmth that began with cold words on a winter wedding night and grew into a fire that warmed not only their hearts, but the hearts of all who knew them. May such warmth be yours as well, now and always.